Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Anne Curzan, Dean of the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts, and I'm here today to introduce Webb Keen, the George Herbert Mead Collegiate Professor of Anthropology. While we wish we could celebrate with Professor Keen in person, today's lecture is being streamed live to maintain social distancing. So for all of you who would like to, if you click on the CC button at the bottom, you can show subtitles or live transcript. And I invite questions throughout the lecture today. You can use the Q&A button again at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and I'll remind you of that a couple of times if you would like to put in questions. Before I begin, I also want to acknowledge the University of Michigan is located on the territory of the Anishinaabe people. In 1817, the Ojibwa, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations made the largest single land transfer to the University of Michigan, seated in the treaty at the foot of the rapids, so that their children could be educated. We acknowledge the history of Native displacement that allowed the University of Michigan to be founded. Today, we reaffirm contemporary and ancestral Anishinaabeg ties to the land and their profound contributions to this institution. Now, collegiate professorships are named at the discretion of their recipients to honor an esteemed faculty member, colleague, or peer. Professor Keen chose George Herbert Mead as namesake of this professorship to honor his role in forming what's often called a crucial bridge between philosophical reflection and social activism, which was instrumental in shaping the modern social sciences. Professor Mead received his master's degree from Harvard University. He came to the University of Michigan as an instructor in 1891. In 1894, with his colleague John Dewey, Professor Mead joined the faculty at the University of Chicago, where he spent the remainder of his career. His expertise across philosophy, anthropology, sociology, social work, and urban reform imparted a unique multidisciplinary aspect to his work. And by combining the philosophical study of pragmatism with Darwinian teachings, Professor Mead influenced how the University of Chicago taught philosophy and sociology and transformed the fields of anthropology and contemporary social theory. Professor Mead approached the social sciences by exploring how self-knowledge comes from, quote, taking the perspective of others. He worked alongside Jane Addams in the settlement house movement and was a supporter of women's suffrage. Professor Mead died in 1931 at the age of 68. His major books, Mind, Self, and Society, The Philosophy of the Act, and The Philosophy of the Present, were published posthumously and remain important works today. And now I get to turn to Professor Keen. Professor Keen has been called a pioneer in his field of cultural anthropology, who, quote, defines whole new areas of inquiry in the discipline. These quotes are coming from his colleagues in the field. The range and importance of his work is often noted for its expansive expertise and wide appeal. One colleague wrote that Professor Keen possesses, quote, a dazzling control of major theory beyond semiotics and beyond anthropology itself. And it is true that his influence can be seen across many other areas, including religion, language, semiotics, material culture, and ethnographic research. His work in Indonesia, for example, studies both religious and secular systems and how they relate to ideas of materiality. Professor Keen's extensive body of research has resulted in a prolific, truly prolific number of highly acclaimed writings. His books, Signs of Recognition and Christian Moderns, are considered classics at this point. And his most recent book, Ethical Life, Its Natural and Social Histories, has been called, and here I quote, an extraordinary achievement that deserves wide readership way beyond anthropology. Not surprisingly, Professor Keen has been recognized on many other fronts. In 2000, he received Rackham Graduate School's Henry Russell Award, which is the university's highest honor for early to mid-career faculty, demonstrating extraordinary accomplishments. He's presented many distinguished lectures, was a Guggenheim Fellow in 2005, and a Fellow at Trinity College, Cambridge University, the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, and Stanford Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences. He taught at Cornell University School of Criticism and Theory and was a visiting professor at the London School of Economics. Professor Keene enjoys similar success as a teacher. He received his PhD in anthropology from the University of Chicago. He came to the University of Michigan in 1991 as a visiting assistant professor before joining the faculty of the University of Pennsylvania. And in 1997, he returned to U of M as an associate professor of anthropology, rising through the ranks to full professor in 2006. In 2013, he was named the George Herbert Mead Collegiate Professor. He has taught at all levels, from foundational undergraduate courses to graduate courses in social theory. Generous with his time, he regularly advises doctoral students, has served on nearly 60 dissertation committees, chairing 23 of those, and has been a PI on 6 NSF dissertation research grants. Professor Keene's many contributions to his field prompted a peer to write, and here I quote, "I cannot think of anybody in his academic generation who I would place above him in any American university." We at the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts are grateful for Professor Keene's many contributions to this institution and find it most fitting that Professor Webb Keene has been named the George Herbert Mead Collegiate Professor of Anthropology. Please join me, and this is where we would do applause if we were in person. We are going to imagine you applauding as we congratulate Professor Keene on his many achievements. So here I'm going to move out of my formal mode and I'm going to say Webb. I am on behalf of we have a lovely large audience here now. I am applauding for everyone. We are just delighted to congratulate you on this. And I really appreciate, you are our first virtual collegiate lecture. And I am very grateful that you were willing to step in and do this. And we're going to do this a little bit differently, as you know, and we're going to start with actually a couple of questions, and then I'll turn it over to you for your formal lecture. But for everyone in the audience, I wanted to start with the question of, how did you get into your field? How did you discover it?
Oh, thank you. And first of all, thank you for letting me see my life pass before my eyes. And I just have to remember, the basic rule in life: never believe your own PR. But thank you for that very generous introduction. There's a long way to tell the story. I'll try to keep it short. But I started out in life as an artist. In fact, the cover of my most recent book is one of my old paintings, which got actually recycled and reconfigured for the poster of this talk. That of my second book was a painting by a studio mate of mine. In those days, we used to repeat something that the painter Robert Motherwell made when he was asked to define sculpture. Sculpture, he snorted. That's something you bump into when you're backing up to get a better look at a painting. Sometimes I feel that way about anthropology. It was something I basically stumbled into, but I feel incredibly lucky for that stumble. So it's a convoluted story. And it was several years before I found my way into the academic world. The story includes me taking an exciting class in philosophy when I was to get rid of a college requirement, a chance encounter in Peru with people working with an indigenous community in the Amazon, conversations with the strange variety of folks I'd met while working nights in a Greenwich Village cafe, and above all, lots of curiosity. But another way to tell the story is like this. One of my teachers in graduate school used to say that anthropologists are driven by the conviction that somewhere, there was a life worth living. What he was pointing to was the fact that the people who forged our discipline were often askew to the mainstream in their home societies. Jews in the 19th century Ivy League, Quakers in Anglican Oxbridge, gays, lesbians, and a scattering of people of color in the early 20th century. Viewing their surroundings from this angle propelled them to look outwards, to seek what other possibilities there were. Well, I can hardly claim marginality for myself, really, in any respect, except perhaps having been a bookworm as a kid. But I grew up in New York City, which is one of the most provincial places in the world. I was surrounded by people who were convinced that they lived in the center of the universe. So there was nothing you needed to know about anything else. Uh, from an early age, this idea troubled me. And the ethnic diversity of the city made it obvious that there are lots of other possible centers to this world, that in fact, anywhere at all might count as central. So to keep ourselves, our own self-importance just seemed terribly claustrophobic. So after a period of painting by day and working nights in the cafe, I took a job as a draftsman in Peru, and somewhere along the way stumbled into anthropology. Why anthropology in particular? I think in part because of its hopefulness. The entire discipline is based on a fundamental premise that people are endlessly inventive. That doesn't mean that anything at all is possible or that everything's just fine. Quite the contrary. Much of the discipline aims to expose harm and understand the roots of suffering. But behind that is a sense of alternatives. And it's that extensive sense of possibility that really counts.
What it's a wonderful story, Webb. Um, and I like the idea of the hopefulness of the field. And so the second question before I turn it over is, what you find most one of the most rewarding aspects of the research that you continue to do. What gets you excited every day to do
Well,
this work?
yeah, um, uh, I've already mentioned anthropology's. Yeah, what gets me out of bed in the morning is the adrenaline rush of realizing I have to face my classes. So it's the students who keep me going in one respect. But I've also mentioned anthropology's built-in hopefulness in my own curiosity. But I want to say something about what's peculiar about this discipline. So one thing that attracted me from the start was the way that anthropology engages with ordinary life in a very direct way. Being based in long-term fieldwork means that even the shyest and the most bookish of us is pushed out of our comfort zones into at home in the academy. So our own way of engaging with the world compels us to go beyond our own interests and research questions because the people we work with talk back to us, compelling us to take seriously their own interests, their own questions. I would never have written my second book, Christian Moderns, had my friends in Sumba not insisted that I pay attention to what mattered to them so much. So that, I think, is just a good way for a scholar to be in the world. In my case, like it or not, I was forced to learn about animal husbandry, Calvinist hymns, and how to thatch a roof. And that meant that however good I might be at being a student, I could never assume that school was the only measure of my qualities. So intellectually, our basis in fieldwork leads us to a very peculiar way of combining the concrete and the abstract, grubby realism and vaunting theoretical ambition. It forces us to be eclectic and improvisational because the situations you encounter are so unpredictable. We sometimes scandalize proponents of big data by the value our research methods place on knowing small numbers of people, but knowing them very well and in lots of different ways. At the same time, although our ethnographic data is usually based on very specific communities and very particular details, we implicitly situate that knowledge in the largest comparative scope of any social science, not just Europe and America, not just the urbanized industrial North, not just the great works of high culture, not just the political movers and shakers, but everything and anything that humans have done and can do. So here's the sort of the paradoxical source of the excitement, I think. Our insights come not just from the intimacy of fieldwork and not just from the very distant view of analysis and comparison. It comes from the way we move back and forth between intimacy and distance. What we gain by foregoing some of the tools of the other social sciences is an openness to chance and to the demands and responses of the people we work with. What keeps me going then is the constant expectation of surprise.
What a totally beautiful and inspiring answer. And with that, I mean, you've set up your talk, the title of which, Can Ethical Critique Change Society Lessons from Ethnography. I'll remind our audience that at any time you're welcome to put a question into the Q&A, or at the end, I'll be monitoring the Q&A and I'll come back and ask questions. And Webb and I will have another conversation. So Webb, thank you. I'm so excited to hear your talk. Let me turn it over to you and your slides.
Thank you, Anne. Now I'm going to ask my tech support, is this looking right? Is this the way it should look?
Yes, you'll just need to click play from start and you should be good.
There we go. Thank you. I clicked it, but it didn't click. Okay, so if you ask a scholar of the liberal arts, what is the purpose of their teaching? Many might answer, to instill a capacity for critical thinking. When critical thinking attends to not just to instrumental, by this critical thinking we mean it attends not just to instrumental means, but to ends. Then if that case, we call it ethical reflection. And yet today, in the midst of present dangers, environmental, humanitarian, political crises, pandemic, economic disaster, and sweeping anti-racist movements, ethical reflection can seem to be a luxury. Problems like these can appear so obvious as to demand immediate action, requiring little further reflection. The politics of crisis can seem to render the probing examination of aspirations, ideals, and values, in short of ethics, an unnecessary distraction from more pressing tasks. Ethnographic research on ethical life takes these questions out of the academy and into everyday life. Drawing on comparative studies in history and ethnography, today I'd like to sketch out some of what I've learned about the dynamics that push ethical intuitions in the direction of social critique and sometimes towards social change. I've chosen examples from the past because I find it easier to see social processes more clearly when I'm not right in the midst of the dust and the fury. My hope, of course, is that somewhat distant examples may help us understand our own circumstances. Now, critique often aims to get us to see matters in a different light, to imagine, to open up what we can imagine. More than that, the ethical imagination, spurred by critique, underlies much of political life. Now, I certainly don't intend to reduce politics to ethics. Some politics is a straightforward matter of struggle for one's own survival and well-being in the face of oppression and harm. Such struggles probably don't require an ethical explanation. Even then, however, the ways people conceive of and argue about harm is likely to draw on their particular visions of human flourishing. Their fundamental and an ethical concepts such as solidarity or justice. In that respect, they measure the objective harms they suffer against some fundamental sense of alternatives, of norms that have been violated. But what about those people whose political commitments cannot be directly explained by self-defense or self-interest? And by everyday ethics, I refer to the values embedded within the practical, embodied, and largely unself-conscious flow of life within particular social and historical contexts. But this leads to a question. What compels one to step outside of the taken for granted flow of life and to see it in a new way, in light of a way of living that does not exist, but that should be the case? What makes it possible for some people to see past the illusions to which everyone around them seems to be prey? So what I want to address today is a very small fraction of this very large set of questions through some examples that center on the way new ethical perspectives can emerge and sometimes reshape political life. Now, one way that ethical critique emerges is when people must persuade others, and in the process discover in their arguments possibilities that they themselves had not noticed before. Here's an example. According to the anthropologist Carolyn Humphrey, 18th century Mongols took for granted a social world that was cross-cut by deeply felt principles of distinction and hierarchy. Differentiated by clan membership and ranked birth order, no one was equal to anyone else. People of various statuses were considered to be fundamentally incommensurable. And yet, Mongols were also preoccupied with notions of fairness. What fairness usually meant, however, was treatment in accord with one's given status. To be fair meant granting people their due in accord with their respective ranks, which were quite distinct from one another. But, Humphrey tells us, one might discover other entailments within this hierarchical concept of fairness. Thus, in 1788, a minor official named Jangi Ashig complained to his superiors who had enslaved some serfs and confiscated others' livestock. And he did so by invoking the familiar language of fairness. Now, Humphrey comments that his petition goes beyond the fairness that would concede that others should have their due. In effect, Jangi Ashig took up an existing ethical language and discovered new possibilities in it. Moreover, he depended on this reworking of the available ethical vocabulary to be recognizable to the superiors he was addressing. This requires what I call the second and third person perspectives. Now, by this, I refer to the ways in which we can shift between different points of view on ourselves and on others. For, indeed, often we are in the midst of the action, probably most of the time, speaking in the first person as I. From being in the midst of the action, we address others directly as you. This means we also anticipate them responding to address me as you in turn. But we can also step back to view matters from the third person perspective, seeing them, that is, in a larger context. This in turn can transform the first person from I to we, or from one kind of we to another. Our ethical self-awareness and our sense of solidarity with others draw on our ability to move between these stances. Now, Jangi Ashig faced his superior as someone to be addressed in the second person, and I speaking to you, someone who might in turn address him. And here, of course, it matters that Jangi Ashig's rank endowed him with a voice, something a serf would presumably have lacked. And he counted on something else. The shared concept of fairness would be recognizable to his addressee, even if it took new forms. It could do so because it was a category that anyone who shared their public world should understand simply by taking the third person stance, the perspective of the outside observer within this society. But Jangi Ashig's innovation might have remained a momentary idiosyncrasy, one with no further consequences. So how does an ethical stance become part of social history? Let's turn to one brief moment, roughly from 1969 to the early 1970s, when American feminists developed the technique of consciousness raising. Consciousness raising was a purposeful attempt to render tacit features of everyday habitual life explicit, objectified so they could be grasped conceptually, redescribed, and reevaluated. It gave rise to new terms like sexism, male chauvinism, sexual harassment, date rape, and even eating disorder. Now, as a radical political project, consciousness raising perhaps ultimately foundered, in part, on an unresolved tension between the subjective experience of the first person stance and the objective claims of the third, the social analysis. And it has been criticized for being mostly of benefit for white middle-class Americans. but it did help change the descriptions of actions and the kinds of personhood that were available for many people. And it shifted aspects of life that had not previously been matters of ethical concern into a new frame of reference, making them visible. It discovered new ways of seeing what had always been there and drew new values from older ones. And in the process, it laid the groundwork for much that followed, from pedagogical norms to the Me Too movement. The creators of consciousness raising hoped that by applying general categories to particular experiences, that this would produce social change. The idea was that because individual women lacked the concepts that would reveal their similarities to one another, they thought their difficulties were due merely to peculiar personal inadequacies. But once individuals compared their experiences, they would be able to create more embracing abstract categories like patriarchy or sexism. New categories would enable them to connect individual sources of unhappiness to something larger, to social oppression, to see particular incidents as instances of general patterns. The emancipatory promise of consciousness raising lay in part in this ability to shift from first person to third person stances through the process of address to a second person. As one activist wrote, "One woman alone who complains of her oppression can be told she is distorting reality. But when a group of women perceive again and again the same patterns of oppression derived from concrete stories of their day-to-day lives, it is impossible to sweep away their words as distortions. The result is collective recognition of some unnameable force that has acted upon them all to make them feel inadequate. The process of recognition should lead here to the naming of that hitherto unnameable force. The result should be not just a redescription of things as they are, but in the process, coming to see new ways of being a person, of flourishing within new forms of social life." Now, much of the power of consciousness raising lay in the attention that it drew to the apparently trivial details of ordinary lives. Talk turned to dieting, the wearing of uncomfortable clothes, and the playing dumb that women undertook for husbands and for bosses. As one woman recalled, "We hadn't realized that just naming the problem and problems would be a radical action in itself. The transformation took place through the redescription of everyday life." Now, finding a common thread through these stories helped participants shift the locus of responsibility away from the purely personal. Its success depended in part on women taking up what I've called a third-person stance on their lives, seeing the particular incidents of my life in terms of general categories of what happens to women as such. For the activists, this should lead them to new ways of identifying with the first person plural, we women. The philosopher Naomi Shaman analyzes one effect of these groups, the discovery by individual participants that they had been angry for years. She wrote, "To discover what we are feeling, our emotions, is not necessarily or usually to discover some new feelings. Rather, it is to discover what all of that means, how it fits in with who we are and what we are up to. These feelings pre-exist the act of naming and of identifying them as a certain emotion. In her account, what changes rather is their cohesiveness and their social standing. The members of a group, one of these consciousness-raising groups, urge a participant to see her anger as justifiable. She learns to redescribe the situation so the emotion becomes a legitimate response. By reconfiguring the ethical world, new conceptual objects are introduced in the form of new types of person, like male chauvinist pigs or liberated women, and new act descriptions, like sexual harassment. They become part of her self-understanding. But the crucial changes are not simply transpiring within the interior life of an individual. In redescribing the situation, what is being altered is the picture, and Schumann again, the picture we are likely to have of what the good life for a woman consists in. The anger becomes legitimate because the woman's current way of living turns out not to be the only one available. New ethical possibilities are imaginable, providing an alternative perspective on things as they are. Although feminist consciousness raising took advantage of the second person address of face-to-face interaction, it fostered the third person stance. Words like sexism invited individuals to see their first person subjective experience from the distant perspective of a sociological category. This is why the sessions were supposed to be simultaneously psychologically emancipating, ethically enlightening, and ideally politically motivating. For the individual should realize that what had seemed to be idiosyncratic subjective experience was not peculiarly her own, in isolation. It was just one instance of a more general objective type. Looking at your own life from this perspective was meant to absolve you. Now, again, this is where perhaps most applicable in this historical instance to white middle-class women coming of age in the mid-20th century, largely in America and parts of Europe. But it was meant to absolve you from taking your unhappiness to be either individual psychopathology, a failure of personal responsibility, or just the misfortune of being in bad relationships. To redescribe your anger is to discover another way to care about other people's anger. It is being able to take the third person stance. My feelings are an instance of a general category, and then reasserting the first person stance. Those feelings are mine, but doing so in a new context. Those feelings are ours. So it is not just knowing how the game of social life is played, but finding that you have a stake in the outcome, even for other people. The criterion for including a particular instance of feelings under the rubric of anger in this view is not its resemblance to other feelings in the abstract, like anger at an incident of road rage or a botched plumbing job or a lost game of tennis or the face of an armed enemy in battle. Rather, it is its resemblance to other situations identifiable as sexism, a recognition that depends on an objectified ethical category. So the way feminists care about it then depends as well on an emerging vision of the good life. The outcome was a new self-description tied to an ethical stance. It became possible to say, I am angry because that's not the way a good life should be lived. Like many social movements, consciousness raising sought ethical revolution through the dynamics of reflexivity by demanding a shift from habit to awareness by way of ethical critique. Now, as I said, clearly, as I've suggested, clearly the voluntarism and the lingering individualism of consciousness raising in this form do mark its sources at a particular time and place among mid-20th century North Americans, largely white, largely middle class, with this very sort of strong basis in ideas about the individual and so forth. But to redescribe and change habits across society has been the goal of all sorts of social movements, from everything from religious reformers to Marxist revolutionaries. So I want to turn now to the Vietnamese Revolution and anti-colonial movement. The historian William Diker concludes his authoritative narrative of the Vietnamese Revolution by asking what explained the success of the communists over rival nationalist and anti-colonial groups in the early 20th century. He concludes that the Confucian emphasis on the social responsibility of elites predisposed many intellectuals to Marxism and was part of their appeal to villagers. Now, given that any large-scale political movement is necessarily shaped by a complex and contingent mix of motives, goals, strategies, and tactics, there can be no straightforward stories to tell here. It can't possibly be just a story about ethics. And of course, Vietnam's case is further complicated by the contingencies of brutal civil war and multiple foreign military interventions, of economic isolation, and so forth. And moreover, the outcome has not always been a pretty picture, as those of you who follow recent events in Vietnam may well know. But in the early period of Vietnam's anti-colonial struggle, the idea of revolutionary ethics played an important role. Reversing orthodox Marxist theories of causation and modifying traditional Confucian lists of virtues, Ho Chi Minh remarked, "If you do not have ethics, you do not have a foundation." Now, of course, Ho was also a tough-minded master of political strategy, but by all accounts, he was quite earnest about the need for a real ethical basis. During the early decades of Vietnam's anti-colonial struggle, amidst the welter of political indoctrination and mobilization, class conflict, military violence, and the harsh tools of governance, are the sinews of an attempted moral revolution. Vietnamese who resisted French colonial domination or otherwise sought to reform or revolutionize society were influenced by Neo-Confucianism, French secular socialism, Catholic moral pedagogy, Buddhism, and a number of new religious movements like Cao Dai. Ho's own education and decades of exile in the North provided him with explicit categories of egalitarian and leftist thought. From the seemingly objective perspective of these categories, Ho was able to take up the third-person perspective, to stand apart and see the Vietnamese situation in a new light, and with new concepts allowing it to be compared to other colonial situations elsewhere. Now, the more obviously coercive aspects of the Vietnamese Revolution are well known: the expropriation of large owners, forced collectivization, and so forth. But what interests me here, however, is how much effort focused on the ordinary ethics of social recognition and respect. Even the ordinary speech patterns of upper-class Vietnamese and French colonials had constantly reinforced contempt from above and humility from below. In place of this, in place of the hierarchy that saturated everyday talk, the anti-colonial movement sought out new egalitarian forms of address. The idea was that even if economic inequalities were done away with for now, old ethical habits would just end up restoring the status hierarchy and its economic consequences if there were not an ethical reform and a genuine egalitarianism. The party took seriously the power of conceptual categories and aimed to teach villagers to see their worlds in terms of the social types of Marxist theory. Villagers had to absorb conceptual categories that would lead them to identify with larger social orders, such as nation, class, and oppressed people, regardless of their own more immediate and concrete experiences. Because the cadres thought that traditional ethics had made villagers passive, they were supposed not to simply indoctrinate them, but to convince them of the new viewpoints through persuasion. This meant that, at least in principle, they had to offer explicit reasons and general principles to justify breaking the habits of traditional life. The practical demands of persuasion then prompted the inculcation of the third-person perspective. One target of these this sort of re-description of the world focused on village rites like weddings and funerals, events that fulfill moral obligations to the ancestors. As the rites came under attack, villagers were forced to make clear choices between competing moral categories and asking of themselves, who am I? A party member? A committed revolutionary? Or a loving mother? A devoted father? A filial son or daughter? Because it was in these rituals and ceremonies that were the villagers' most public performances when they were carrying them out in front of everyone. That would mean that it meant that these choices of these self-descriptions were open to the ethical evaluation and challenge by the entire village or the entire community. Needless to say, such reformist efforts were neither uniform nor entirely successful. The tumultuous history the villagers had lived through itself was fraught with ethical troubles that forced them to reflect, to innovate, and to invent. For instance, the massive violence of warfare undermined some of the very practical means available for living an ethical life. Both village traditions and revolutionary ethics postulated, for example, a moral hierarchy of death. There was the cool, good death at home, surrounded by family, ritually attended to, memorialized afterwards. There was the bad death, out of the village, left somewhere, exposed, unknown, unattended to, without the proper rituals. Neither village traditions nor revolutionary ethics, however, could deal with situations like this, as described by a survivor of one massacre during the war. He said, after a flood, when the floodwaters subsided, we saw many skulls and bones. I do not know whether the skull belonged to my mother or my neighbor's sister-in-law. That's not a proper life. That's not a life at all. The war's large-scale killing destabilized the available ethical categories and the means of fulfilling them. According to one ethnographer, Hunuk Kwan, the victims were simple villagers, and they were not. They were heroic defenders of the native land, and they were not. There were the categories wouldn't stabilize. People could not find their place within them. Decades after the My Lai massacre, Kwan found that villagers were still putting out offerings for the wandering ghosts of 3 American GIs. Elsewhere, the site of another battle and massacre, offerings were left for both a Korean Marine and South Vietnamese soldier. Faced with unprecedented circumstances, villagers improvised, developing new ethical vocabularies, new practices out of those they found ready to hand. And these could not be easily sorted out neatly into discrete categories of political on the one side and ethical on the other. They were value-laden grapplings with the world of political facts. The Vietnamese turmoil shows us people struggling to assert ethical agency over their historical circumstances. Ethical in that it is directed toward a counterfactual world, a world the way things should be but are not. delineated in terms of intuitions of value. That sense of agency is in part afforded by the third person stance that allows them to step back outside the ongoing flow of everyday experience and see their lives and possibilities in new ways. In Vietnam, the third person perspective was shaped within objectified descriptions of reality provided by Confucian, Buddhist, and French moral pedagogy, the Marxist-Leninist theories of history, and the social categories that presupposed, always under pressure from the practicalities and contingencies of total mobilization and drastic warfare. If the history that resulted could never be told purely in ethical terms alone, neither, I think, can we make sense of it without them. So let me close then with two thoughts. First, no way of living is so taken for granted as to exclude any chance of stepping aside outside of our habitual way of living, our unselfconscious moving forward and taking up a third person stance. For sometimes people, most of the time perhaps, people find themselves in the midst of the action, but sometimes they stand apart from it. But, and this is my second point, the third person stance cannot provide a complete understanding of ethical or political life, since to take it up by the same token moves us out of the perspective of the first person. And it is, in the end, the first person stance that endows us with the biographies, the commitments, the relationships, the expectations, and the vulnerabilities that situate us in a world that we care about and that we're motivated to act in. So we should not expect that our science, our philosophy, or our politics will lead us to some position so utterly transcendent that it will secure our ethical intuitions once and for all. And even if such an unassailable position were possible, I suspect one would find oneself like perhaps Jangi Ashig, the Mongol official, watching an American consciousness raising session. He might be curious, perhaps even knowledgeable, but unlikely to care how it turns out. But even this would be just part of the story, since Jangi Ashig would have his own games to care about. He too can move between the first and third person stances. Indeed, that capacity to move back and forth between those perspectives seems to be crucial to the articulation of ethical and political life. There is no reason to expect either position to be the final one. The potential for movement between them is an endemic feature of ethical life, ethical existence, an endemic feature of social existence and its ethical dimensions. Thank you.
Webb, I'm applauding for the many, many people out there who are also applauding. Thank you. What a thoughtful and beautifully crafted lecture. And of course, the linguist in me loved the framing with first, second, third person. And I have a question, but there's already a really important question in the Q&A, and I would like to remind everyone that we would love to see your questions in the Q&A. So if you have a question, please send it in. So I want to, this question, Webb says, thank you for a wonderful talk. Can you talk about similarities between the consciousness raising movement of 1968 and some of the more recent social movements like Black Lives Matter? And I was thinking, as you talk about the world the way it should be, as opposed to the way that it is.
Well, as I said, it's easier to see things from a distance than to see things when you're in the midst of them. So I've that's why I chose examples that were not right in the midst, in the here and now. Because on the one hand, it seems to me very clear that the Black Lives Matter has induced a kind of consciousness raising, all over the country. Um, uh, which includes sort of, on the one hand, awareness, a reawakening of things that many of us knew all along, but also an exposure of things that we hadn't known or hadn't wanted to know or had forgotten. Um, uh, so if many, so if um, sort of the basic sinews of racism have been, well known for a long time. The nature of white privilege, for example, is something that I think was easier to miss, easier not to notice if it was yours. Right? Whether now here I have to be very careful and say that just being aware and being in the redescription of the world is never in itself sufficient. It's not, it can't be the only part of the story. It wasn't in Vietnam, and it wasn't in second wave feminism. But my argument is it is at least a crucial component both for creating new forms of solidarity, motivating people to act who might not have been motivated otherwise, and let's say clarifying goals, clarifying what the ends and purposes of mobilization really ought to be.
So thank you. And I think, I mean, it was, and thinking about the power of stories told together, right? I mean, as you were talking about through the talk, and the power of that. So another question, again, what a wonderful lecture. Thank you. I want you to hear that, because we didn't, in this medium, we don't get to hear the applause. I'm struck by some of the resonances with the phenomenological tradition, particularly Merleau-Ponty's thoughts on the relationship between self and other. How does your work speak to this tradition?
That there's a very clear connection there. I should say that in my little autobiographical introduction, the philosophy course I took to get rid of a requirement introduced me to Merleau-Ponty, in fact. So he's in there, he's lurking in the background. What the difference is, I think, and for those of you who aren't steeped in this kind of vocabulary, phenomenology is a philosophical school that focuses primarily on experience, particularly embodied experience and subjectivity of how we live as in our bodies. So this, you might say, is crucial to understanding what the first person stance is, the first person position is. What phenomenology I think has more trouble accounting for is that movement out of the possibility of taking up this outside stance. When it traditionally, I think when phenomenologists encounter that outside, that what I've called the third person stance, they treat it as some kind of a failure, a falling away from authenticity, for example, in the mid 20th century vocabulary, an alienation from the self, that it can only be a bad thing. Can only be a form of self-estrangement. And what I'm interested in is the way in which it can also be empowering. It can give you insights as well, not just the insights of scientific objectivity, but the insights of seeing patterns, the patterns that you yourself are situated within. That's something that I think we need to supplement the phenomenological account of subjectivity by taking seriously the fact that stepping outside of personal experience is also something everyone does, not just scientists and not just intellectuals and not just moderns in the conventional terminology. Everyone can do this and does do this.
So we have another question here, which is, how can we invoke consciousness raising and third person perspectives among large groups of non-unionized people, such as undergraduate students at a university?
I would say that what creates a union is a movement out of fragmented individuals and the recognition of a grounds for solidarity with other people. And that doesn't it and to understand how one comes to recognize that one is part of this larger category and what determines what that category is something that doesn't just come from first person experience alone. It requires drawing on categories of thought, categories of identity, and recognizing how you might fit into them. Right. So that if you think about the history of the union movement, it's one of essentially workers discovering that they were more than just people going to a job, but were people who had some kind of fundamental identity with other workers in other factories, let's say. And that is itself a kind of consciousness raising. It's not the same as sitting in a living room chatting, but it took different forms. It took the forms of news sheets and lectures, workers' lectures, and there are all sorts of forms this can take. Today, it might take the form of primarily social media, among other things. It doesn't have to be in people sitting around in living rooms.
So I'm going to try to get in. I can get in at least one more, and then and I also want to share the praise. So thank you for a lovely talk. What are some of the ways you've seen these ideas of ethical critique and the ways it changes society play out in your lifetime and or affect you personally?
It's hard to escape the present moment. That kind of has a strong effect, but I'm just old enough. I was a kid during the Vietnam War, but that had a profound effect on me. Even just being a kid, and when you grew up in New York, there were demonstrations out the window, peace marches. So there was that. There was, the hippies down the street who were, convinced us that the world was going to change radically tomorrow. There were the Panthers who were also visible out the window, and the Black Panthers. And then there were huge disappointments that followed that. So one of the things that I guess I would say is in difficult times, I think it's important to remember that there have been disappointments before and that we have come out of them. That sounds kind of Pollyannish. I am not by nature a Pollyanna, so I don't want to, but I do think that a historical perspective should give us a sense, not of optimism perhaps, but at least of hope. Right? Like as the slogan goes, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will.
Okay, and Webb, I'm going to sneak in one more, and so if you can answer it briefly, and then we'll wrap it up. But it's again, thank you for this insightful talk. How would the third person, I'm thinking especially of the second wave feminism case, who isn't me and will never be reasserted in the we, that is the other. Specific example, men, how do they fit into this triad ethical stance model? Because this they also contributes in the naming and objectification of experience. For instance, men participating in naming women's emotions as anger. And this language is then accepted and adopted by the I to name and describe the I experience.
Oh, wow. Yeah, good.
I know, that's why I was like, I have to put that question in there.
How much time do we have? I mean, that is, that opens up, that requires a really long conversation. So I can't possibly do justice to that question other than to say You know, I like to think dialectically. So I think that one of the things that happened was what had gotten called anger by men, let's say in the quotation that I gave there, gets reappropriated and retransfigured and thrown back in new form, right? So that you know, you're not, the description didn't stick. Or it didn't, you know, the people who took it up did not allow it to determine what they were going to make of it. Now we can also say that, you know, the women's movement had an effect on men too, not, you know, not always the effect that they would have wanted it to, and not on all men. You know, produced reactions against, as well as reactions of solidarity. But it certainly changed the world in which men found themselves, minimally. I'd like to think much more than that, but minimally, it changed the context within which they found themselves.
So Webb, we have more good questions. We'll save this. And of course, I have all these questions about, you know, this power of naming and language, because as you've been talking about categories, these get expressed in language, and the linguist in me is very excited to continue this conversation. But I also know that it is just after 5 o'clock. And I want to, for everyone who was here, and I was delighted to see so many people here to celebrate you and your career and your work. We want to say thank you. And I have here in my office a gift. We have a poster for you framed of this talk, which we will get to you because as just a token and a way to remember this really special day and this lecture. So thank you so much on behalf of everyone who was here, for all that you do and for this lecture today.
Well, thank you, Anne, and you know, thank you everyone who's supported me over the years. You know, I didn't get a chance to express my deep, deep gratitude for endless numbers of people.
So thank you everyone for being here. We hope you have a peaceful evening. Bye everyone.
Bye-bye.